Good afternoon. I think I'm live now and I'm happy to be here. I'm happy that you joined us also for this opportunity to learn from each other and spark some curatorial energy. Because today we will discuss the superpowers of curatorial practices in music. I should like to introduce myself. I'm Mirjam Zegers, and I'm Coordinator Curatorial Practices in Music at ArtEZ University of the Arts. Brandon, welcome to this table. Dr. Brandon Farnsworth defended his PhD in 2020 at the University of Music Karl Maria von Weber in Dresden, which resulted in the book Curating Contemporary Music Festivals. Warmly recommended. And Ed McKeon is a producer, lecturer, writer, and PhD researcher specializing in post-experimental music. And he will finish his PhD this summer. Through his not-for-profit company Third Ear Music, he commissions and produces work on the borderlines of music and many other practices. In this session, we will enter into conversations about the potential of curatorial practices in music for the future of classical music or music in general. After these introductions, as said, we will go into roundtables and they will be hosted by the three of us and also by Susanna Salka, who works at the Liszt Academy in Budapest for many years. I will introduce her later, and is now part of the Heritage Program at the Central European University in Vienna, and Annemarie Reitsma, who you also will see later, head of the Master of Music at ArtEZ University of the Arts. Curatorial practices. Well, for some 50 years now, I have been developing ways together with many others to include curatorial thinking and the superpowers that go along with it into the curriculum of the ArtEZ Conservatory. First in a small pilot course in 2007 and 8, then as a Master's in Music Programming from 2009 to 13. We have 8 outstanding graduates. You might know them. They work on key positions in Dutch musical life. Since 2019, the subject has become central to the curriculum of the Master of Music in Zwolle. And as part of this transformation, Annemarie Reitsma has asked me to develop a new trajectory, which now consists of 2 courses: Defining Your Vision and Curatorial Leadership and Management. As a result of COVID, we went fully digital, which brought an international group to the table. And the subject attracts a high level of participants, I must say. Apparently, it speaks to creative thinkers that refuse to take things as they are for granted. You may see some of them today as they will be joining our lounges and roundtables later. But what are curatorial practices in music? In fact, that is the main topic of the course. And in fact, no one knows. Irid Rogoff and Jean-Paul Martinon, in his book, The Curatorial, to which we refer in the name of the course, state that the meaning is fundamentally open. Therefore, in our conversation of today, I wouldn't bother too much about definitions, but propose that we jump directly to its potential implications and value for reality. We do not need the word curator for curatorial practices to happen, and some really good curators prefer to avoid the word for good reasons. I do want to share some topics that keep popping up in conversations on curating as a kind of starting point. So again, how can we describe the curator? The word comes from taking care. And over the past half century, the curator has come up first mainly in the visual arts, later also in the performing arts, as someone who realizes exhibitions or festivals by selecting artists and inviting them to make work for a specific context, typically about a specific theme. A returning element in this description of curators is a focus on relational aspects of the arts rather than artworks as objects. In music, this chimes with Christopher Small, who coined the term musicking to express a concept of music as an activity. It's a verb in which all present are involved rather than an object. For instance, the score. Curators also like to involve audiences in specific new ways, sometimes with a kind of activist approach, trying to move the audience to see things differently, criticize existing structures, open up new approaches and ways to not only see the world, not only see the world, but also make a new world. These things are all very valuable and urgent in times of crisis, so we are lucky. We are now facing several crises at once, so you choose which one to take in mind. The crisis of classical music in general, orchestras, young audiences, COVID-19. In early Greece, crisis was a neutral term, referring to a turning point and moment of judgment, as Jan Soa remarks in one of the inspiring books in the series Performing Urgency. He continues, any future turn of events depends ultimately on our ability to properly judge the situation we are in. I would like to invite you to do just that, to look carefully into present-day practices. Curating is looking critically at the infrastructures, selection mechanisms, habits in communication, involvement and transparency, including the lack of these. Another word for a curator is a catalyst, and I prefer this word actually. A catalyst is the element that enables, or rather provokes, transformation processes. Compared to the conservator, who is focusing on preserving things for the future, the curator takes care of active and activating encounters that really bring something new into the world. Or in someone's world. I would like to invite you to take audiences as a starting point in our conversation and radically rethink their present and potential roles. Technology offers a lot of possibilities in marketing, communication, and also in streaming the real thing. While doing all this, it is essential to keep an open eye and ear for the implied picture of the potential audience members we have in mind. Is this person a regular ticket buyer, very good at sitting still and be silent for 2 times 45 minutes? Is she a real musician's friend, loving conversations afterwards about the performance details, connecting with every crowdfunding campaign that you are offering? Is he maybe a dummy in classical music who applauds at the wrong moments and moves his body when that is just not the idea? Do they need any information beforehand, or would they rather be immersed in an unforgettable intellectual or bodily experience? Curatorial practices can think through the whole process and not leave these relations to marketing colleagues, for whom processes are basically successful once tickets have been sold. And I might be now get some responses later from the marketing people. I look forward to that. Curators can put audiences at the core of the whole programming process. In theatre, the 19th century was a century of actors. The 20th century was a century of directors. And the 21st century is a century of spectators, as Brzezinska mentioned in the same book I mentioned before. We see this in music as well, with musicians, of course, in the 19th century, conductors in the 20s, and again, spectators in the 21st century. So, time to emancipate spectators, together with Jacques Rancière, maybe. Curators can think of different ways to connect with audiences and put them on the first row. One thing is clear, the 19th century audience does not exist anymore. What preparations would 2040 audiences need to enjoy classical music? Look at the children of today. Will they become audiences of tomorrow? So, for the discussion, I would like to propose that we carefully judge the situation we are in, starting with audiences. What elements of current audience relations in classical music should we cherish and take with us into the future? And what new elements would we need to build strong relations with 2040 audiences? See you later, I hope. I look forward to discuss this with you, and I now pass the word to Ed McKeon.
Miriam, thanks very much. And it's a real pleasure to join you on this panel, and also with Brandon. I mean, two people who have really pioneered thinking and practice around the curatorial and music. I'm going to be talking also without slides. It's going to be an analog performance. I've got a slight cold, you might hear, but do bear with me. I want to start by asking whether we can address the future of classical music without considering how classical music addresses the future. I'll give a brief account of this relationship and how it relates to issues of curating and event formats. At the heart of this lies the question of whether something called musical time is different from the time that it takes to listen. Classical music demonstrates that time does not, or previously did not, stand still. It moved, and it moved emotions. As a set of cultural practices, it emerged in the modern period alongside a new awareness of time, a time of revolutions, French, American, industrial, with a novel self-consciousness of what it meant to be a subject of history. History was something that you made. Indeed, the very term classical music indicated a profound attachment to a model of historical destiny founded on the mythic ideal of the rediscovery of the classical worlds of Greece and Rome. So, first question, how might your experience today of, say, Haydn's Creation contrast with how it touched those attending its first performance at Vienna's Burgtheater in 1799? Is it the same work? Composers and musicians adapted equal tempered tonality to this novel way of being, of creating one's destiny, as a set of techniques to order the experience of being in time. We might think of classical repertoire as time capsules that used key structures and their harmonic frameworks, modulation, voice leading, and cadential formulas to create feelings of anticipation, departure, deferral, and arrival. These ordered relations between past, present, and future, musical journeys or adventures that could be lived through at the same time as they were heard. So, for example, the difference between Beethoven's Eroica and Wagner's Parsifal is about 3 hours, or put another way, about 80 years, including the Napoleonic Wars and the revolutions of 1848, among other significant events, both political and personal. Could Beethoven have written Parsifal, or had the feeling of what it meant to experience time changed? This organization of temporal experience was especially strong for music without text or other referential system that pointed to a meaning or time outside of its own. It also involved a stilling of the body, as classical music was detached from its use in social dancing and other forms of public assembly, pageant, religious ceremony, and ritual. Concert practices were established and formalized to set apart these expressions of time from everyday temporal experience. The development of a musical canon as an absolute standard for all music effectively instituted this linear temporality, projected towards the future as a kind of timeless time, a way of being oneself in time that was itself eternal, immutable, always alpha and omega. Comparing novels or actual historical accounts from the 19th and 20th centuries shows a marked shift over time of what it has meant to attend a concert. Concert time has changed as everyday time has changed. As historical time did not stand still after all, the gap between contemporary lived experience and this preserved notion of time widened. We might even consider the trajectory of music since the early 20th century as so many attempts to critique, remodel, or pose alternatives to this measure of temporality. The move to atonality and serialism, a new accent on rhythm, turns to sound, silence, and noise, uses of citation and parody, emphases on repetition and drones, the manipulation of sound recordings, all speak of a desire to offer alternative ways of being in time. Was Luigi Nono's Prometeo still classical? Is it now to be classified in this most peculiar of terms, contemporary classical? What of Lamont Young, John Cage, Julius Eastman, Laurie Anderson, Nicole Lizet, George Lewis, and of course, not just the North Americans? For this discussion, then, I want to emphasize a less noted but intimately related shift over time, especially from the 1960s, that of concert practices that traditionally ordered these time capsules of historical and contemporary repertoire. Just as the art gallery struggled to contain much of the new art emerging after painting and sculpture, think of Christo's Wrapped Buildings, Adrian Piper's Funk Lessons, or works of institutional critique such as Chris Burden's Samson. So the 90-minute concert with interval in the unamplified concert hall without other media facilities may not suffice for the experience of audiences in 2040, let alone 2021. I'm quite aware that the earlier session covered a number of these points and a number of examples directly. An understanding of the curatorial moves us from the paradigm of programming within a concert format that remains broadly unchanged, that maintains the separation of musical time from lived time. It invites us instead to think about how events are structured as ways of being in time together with others, people both similar to and unalike me or us. We can approach ourselves as historical subjects by recognizing our contemporary moment as something we produce together rather than something that exists independently of us. Might classical music have something altogether different to offer 240 years after Haydn's creation? Not one way of being in time, perhaps, but a repertoire of ways of being together in time. Here, time might be simultaneously past, present, and future, an articulation of combined and collective actions of memory, self-awareness, and intuitive anticipation. I invite us all to consider what kind of event structures might be adequate for this task, and how might repertoire fit into or adapt to these. Thank you very much. Over to Brandon.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Thanks, Miriam. Wonderful. Let me just cover my screen here. It's quite distracting to always look at yourself while you're talking. Great. My contribution is called Our Classical Music, Memory and Intention. So in January 2019, the Danish Composer Society released its report of repertoire statistics for music played by symphony orchestras, operas, ensembles, and music festivals for the 2015, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 18, 19 seasons, so for 3 seasons. The report found that 3/4 of the music that had been performed was composed between, the 3/4 of the music that had been performed was composed before 1985, and that 99.9% of that music was composed by men. Music after 1985 was only 86% by men, which is not much better. So on a similar note to that quite problematic statistic, as part of the evening he curated as part of the Märzmusik Festival at the Berliner Festspiele in March of this year, music scholar George Lewis, who we've just mentioned, pointed out what he called the suspicious absence of Afro-diasporic composers in our histories of 20th century modernism. This fact has led him to compile lists of long-ignored Afro-diasporic composers and to program evenings of music such as he did at the Berliner Philharmonie with Ensemble Moderne in order to, as he says, address this impoverishment of music history, which has been robbed of this historical context, intellectual atmosphere, and listening experience. These statistics are unfortunately not exceptional. They are a small sample of the deep inequalities present in classical music, which collectively show that, quote, the subjectivities required to work and succeed in the classical music profession are gendered, classed, and racialized, end quote. In a system of exclusion that starts with education and persists through the professional careers of composers, of working musicians, and of music educators. Classical music then makes a claim to, it then makes a claim to objectivity and to universality despite its long history of these systematic exclusions, effectively erasing its erasure in a double move typical of modernist thinking. So against this rather damning background, I'd like to return to the symposium's question as to the future of classical music in 2040 and ask, how will classical music deal with this legacy of exclusion? Will the classical canon in 20 years still contain only the same few white Western men, while wondering why nobody else seems able to be inscribed into our cultural memory? If it's not to be the case, and personally I certainly hope it will not be, how must we transform our thinking today across classical music's many interdependent systems, from music schools to symphony halls, in order to address this? To ask such questions is to acknowledge that our classical music past and future are only made part of the present by memory and intention, respectively, meaning that the only way to change our future position is to forge a different path today. To realize our vision of the field in 19 years from now, which is not very long, will mean understanding the myriad ways in which we are currently embedded in and shaping its present, which will inevitably continue with exclusions and omissions unless we act today. In light of this, I want to address with my second point here something more specific to the understanding of curating itself in our field. As Miriam Shagers has already mentioned, curatorial practices are understood as a kind of affective care work for the relations and collectivities that form and inform us. In light of this, I want to push back a little bit against the understanding of curatorial practice as being about inventing new formats in order to better sell pre-existing music to more or to younger audiences, sort of figuring out how to package it. Instead, I want to insist on curatorial practices in music being about asking more fundamental questions, like I just did, about what ideas and values are being rehearsed, performed, and therefore, again, strengthened in our concert halls every night, and whether these are in line with how we and our musical communities want to live in the world. Such a thinking should be unafraid of venturing into the what I would call third rail questions of classical music, such as its share of local cultural funding budgets, its consistent delusions of universality, dubious given its aforementioned identity-based canonical omissions, or its loss of relevancy in contemporary intellectual life. Such a thinking begins instead by asking what structures, what processes have constituted these systems we inhabit today, and works within and without them in order to realize a vision of the future better able to share in the global musical reality we inhabit. I argue that the result of such a transformation would be a musical community that is able to engage in a more healthy way with the world of other musics around it, and in doing so begin to shape its future. So for my aspect of the discussion, or what I would be interested in addressing in discussion, is that designing a classical music future means re-examining the memories and intentions embedded in our classical music present. So I'd like to ask how we can change classical music today in order to address its practices of inclusion. What initiatives can you undertake in your institutions, and where the resistances lie and why? Thank you. And I think I hand it back to Miriam now.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Thank you, Ed. There is really a lot to discuss. So I would like to invite you to conference lounges now. In the chat, I'm sharing the titles and content of the 5 lounges. Lounge 1, social inclusion. 2, role for venues. 3, the musical event. 4 practices of exclusion, and 5 emancipating audiences. Before you leave, I also share a small link where you can leave your email address if you want to stay in touch. And then I hand the word, I think, to Guylaine, who will tell us more about how to get into the lounges. Thank you for being here, and I hope to continue the conversation soon. Oh, one more thing. After these lounges, we will also get back in the discussion table from 4:10. So if you want to catch up, please be there as well. So bye. See you in a minute.